Hi, I'm Flo, and I create digital painting tutorials for Procreate. And during this workshop, I will show you how you can add realistic lighting and reflections to glass, like this perfume bottle, for instance. You'll be able to find any assets I'll be using during this workshop below the video. During this workshop, I'll just be showing how you can add these realistic lighting effects, so I already had a jump start with this painting. You can grab this image below the video as well, so you can get started right away. So are you ready? Let's get started. Alright, first let me show you my layers. I always try to use as few layers as possible. So right now I just have a background layer and a bottle layer. And I'll be painting directly on that bottle. Now, if you feel a bit insecure, if you're afraid that you might mess the bottle up, then you can just duplicate the layer. So we'll swipe to the left and click duplicate. Now you always have a backup. Let's just turn it off. That'll be our backup file, our backup layer. And now we can get started adding those highlights to our bottle. As you can see, I have a reference image on the left side. That's really my perfume bottle. And if you want to open up a window on the side of your screen, all you have to do is swipe up from the bottom of your screen on the iPad, grab the app you would like to use and drag it to the side of your screen to open it in a secondary window. Alright, so first thing I would like to do before I get started painting is set this layer to alpha lock. I will click the layer and select alpha lock. Now this way I will only be able to paint on the shape that's already there. So I'll only be able to paint on the bottle and not outside of the bottle. So that way I make sure that everything stays clean and tidy. Now let's go to the brushes. During this workshop, I'll be using my basic brush set, and I'll get started with the Lighten line brush. This is my favorite brush to add little highlights to my work. And I can just grab a local color and get started adding those highlights. Let me zoom in on the reference image, and I'll just start at the top of this bottle. Now let me just grab a very light gray here. And let me check the brush. Well, that's small enough. And I'll only focus on the really bright highlights that I see in this image. And I'll try to replicate those on the bottle that we got here. And you can rotate your image, of course, if you feel like that works a bit better for you. Or you can rotate your entire iPad, of course, but I can't do that in this case. And I'll just try to replicate those brightest shapes that I see. I'm slowly building it up, making this shape. And I can make these very thin lines as well. And of course, you don't have to copy the reference image exactly. It doesn't have to be an exact copy. But we do want it to look like that shiny, reflective glass. So yeah, what makes this bottle look like it's made from glass? Well, that's those very bright highlights that you're seeing. That's what makes it look like glass. And of course, we can go adding them in random places. So we try to stick to the reference a little bit. But don't worry if your highlight looks a little bit different from the one you're seeing in the image. So I'm not thinking about any spots that might need to go a bit darker or need a different color. I'm really only focusing on those brightest highlights. You can see a bright thin line here. at the top of the bottle. And you can play around with the size of the brush a bit. I'm at 8% right now. There's this little, very thin line right here at the top of that fluid. And you can move around your reference image a bit. And still just really only focusing on those very bright highlights. Don't get distracted by anything else. For me, it always helps to stop thinking about what you're painting, about the subject, and that it needs to look like a bottle. And I use this on every painting. I just try to focus on the shapes that I'm seeing, forgetting about the subject that you're painting. So now I'm just focusing on this very light shape here beneath that bottle cap. And try to look at the angles of the shapes you're making. Look at how big they are. Look at how far they are apart from each other. Those are things that really help, well, in your painting process. Measuring everything in your painting. And you'll see that, well, while you're just focused on these little shapes, once you start zooming out at a later stage, you'll be surprised at how realistic it'll start to look. I'm just going shape by shape and just using that Lighten line brush. And if you want to use the Lighten line brush for anything else, just be sure that you use it on the layer on which the colors are that you're painting on, because the Lighten line brush will lighten the colors that are underneath it. And I usually just pick the local color that I'm working with. So right now I have picked a light gray because I'm at the top of that bottle and most of it is gray. But once I start going down in this image, I will probably pick that pink. Now we got quite a big light area here. So I want to lighten that up as well. And also we have this edge. You can see that over there. It's a very light edge here. And since we have alpha lock turned on, we can just go over that edge and really brighten that up. I'm slowly making my way down that bottle. In the middle, you can see that, well, it's kind of like a little straw that's stuck in that bottle. I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller. I'm at 4%. Just make a little line here, suggesting that, well, I guess it's a little straw. Not sure, maybe it has another name. And I also can see a lighter line just below that dark shape. And usually during my painting process, I switch between working on very light areas like this, working on those brightest highlights, and working on the dark shapes. And for the dark shapes, I often use the darken line brush or just the basic flow brush, which is good for just about anything. Also have a light part here. So you can switch back and forth between painting those highlights and painting those darker areas. And every time you make that switch, just only focus on either those lightest areas or those darkest areas. Don't let yourself get distracted by anything else. And also try to zoom out every once in a while because you can really get lost in the details. But it's really not about those small details. It's about how everything adds up together. It's about how it looks like from a distance. I can see a very bright line there. I'm going to pick this local color and make a line in this fluid. It's almost all the way from the left to the right, very thin. And also this top of the fluid is also a bit lighter. And it's okay if you miss some areas. We can always go back later, adding some more, those highlights. We can see some small ones here. I can see that we can use a little bit more highlights on this left side. So I'll pick that gray again. And I want to add some more over here. And we can see that that cap, it's reflected on this surface here. I think the top is already looking quite good. We can move down on our bottle. Let's work on this left side here. I'm going to pick that local color by just holding my finger on the screen. And let's make some straight lines going down. We can see that it's a bit thicker around here and a bit lighter as well. So we can make multiple strokes here, making it lighter. We can see another shape right next to it here. So here as well, not thinking about the bottle, just about these very bright shapes that I'm seeing. I'm going to make the brush a bit bigger. Let's go to 10%. Don't worry about copying it exactly and precisely. We can see a light line right next to this one. So I really don't worry yet about that darker edge that I can see there. We'll get to that later. You can also see some light parts here at the bottom. And I can also see that those bright lights at the bottom, they are a bit purplish, pinkish. So let me just pick a purplish color for those. Perhaps something like this. I'll just try it out. I don't use any set colors. I experiment while I work. You know, if it doesn't work, you can always hit undo, try another color, but I can see that I think this works quite nicely. Adding a bit of a purplish, bluish shade here. I'm just making some random little lights here. Just little vertical like dabs going from left to right. For those upper parts here, I want to use a more pinkish color. So I'll slide towards the reds, grabbing this pink color. We have this little curve here. I'll turn my canvas a little bit to make it a bit easier. And just follow that curve that I had already created. Adding those pinkish touches. And we're still just using that Lighten line brush. With my basic brush set, I literally use it for all of my paintings. It's always the base for everything. For all of my paintings, and I just use other brush sets for, well, like details or for hair. But the base, it always starts with the basic brush set. It's the base to start with for me. All right, let's go to that right side and add more highlights there. I'll pick the local color again. And let's add brighter highlights here on this side. Like at the bottom here. Some really bright spots here. And then we'll make those vertical lines again. They're a bit curved. So I'm just trying to mimic what I see in my reference image. And if things are going a bit too fast for you during this session, then you can always just rewatch it later and hit pause and rewind. You can just take your time. Let's zoom out a bit to check it out. I think it's already starting to look like glass. I feel like I can lighten up that center part a bit more here. And let's add some tiny dabs of light on that logo part here. I'm going to make the brush smaller, 4%. I'll just add tiny little dabs here, because I can see some little reflections there on the real bottle. Those are just tiny little touches that can add to the realism. Let me also add a little bit of light here. There's a tiny little bubble. All right, now that we have got these brightest parts, we can add some darker parts. Like I said before, I like to use the darken line brush for that. That's for the tiny dark details. And again, even with this brush, you can just pick up local colors and use those. Oh, and by the way, you can of course duplicate the layer here. If you feel insecure about the steps, then just duplicate it so that you always have a backup. I'm just going to continue working on this layer. And I'll grab this local gray and I'll darken some of these areas here. Let's set the brush to 8%. And oh, the opacity is at 34, by the way. Let me check for the Lighten line brush. I think it's the same. Well, it's at 30. That just gives you a little bit more control than when you set it to 100%. I can just make multiple strokes, slowly building up those dark areas. So right now, instead of focusing on those really bright areas, I really focus on the small, darkest shapes. Like this thin line here, for instance. A really thin, dark line. I'll go smaller to 5%. We can also see some pretty dark parts right here. And I always zoom out every once in a while to check my progress. And when you feel like some areas are getting a bit too rough, what I like to do is go to the smudge tool and use the blender, which is also in my basic set. It is set to 35%. Let me make it a bit smaller, like 13%. And you can just go over those edges, smudging them a little bit, getting a softer transition. So I often do that in combination with the darken line brush and the lighten line brush as well. I'll just drop some dark shapes and some light shapes and then blend them a little bit with the blender to get a softer look. You don't want to go too soft though. We want some nice crisp highlights here because that's what'll make it look like glass. So I've added some darker parts there at the top. Now I also want to work on this left side where we can also see some darker areas. I've just picked that local color. Let me make the brush a bit bigger, 12%. And I'll just go along that edge, adding a little dark line. You can see that it's a little bit bluish, purplish there. So let me pick a bluish, purplish color. Let's go for something like this, and I'll use that with the darken line brush to work on that shadow. It's pretty strong, and if I don't want it to be too strong, what I usually do is just pick up that color and then use that lighter version of it. Again, with that darken line brush. I can see some shadow here. Let's also do it on the right side of the bottle. I'll just go along that light edge, that light line that I created, and add a little touch of dark here as well. Adding these darker lines that'll really give a boost to those bright areas. Now we can darken some of the areas here a bit. Just refine it. It's pretty dark here. Looking good. Let's see what we have just done. We can just turn off that layer. Well, no, of course now we need to turn on our backup layer so we can check the difference. You can see what just some shapes with the lighten line and a darken line brush, what those little shapes did. We already got that nice, realistic, glassy feel. What I also always like to do is go over my paintings with the overlay brush. This is a soft brush which is set to overlay, and we can use it to boost colors in our painting. And add little color variations. Like at the top of the bottle, I can see some of those pinkish purplish colors as well. So let me just pick that purple that we used earlier. And the brush is set at a low opacity, 15%. And I'll set it to 20% in size. And I'll just gently glaze over the top. I can make the brush a bit smaller even. Let's go for 6. And I can just go over some areas. And if you're afraid to use it, then just make sure that you duplicate your layer first. You can also use it at the bottom a bit. And let's also grab a reddish color to boost that fluid a little bit. So we can go over that top. And here at the bottom as well. It's really subtle, but it does add to your painting. And while I was doing this, I could see that this area, it can use a little bit more light. The brush that I'll use for that is the Lighten brush. It's a bit softer than the Lighten line brush, but still it's great for adding subtle light. Let me first pick that local color. I'll go even lighter. It's almost white. Now let me just go over that area. The brush is set to 70% opacity. Size is at 12%. And I'll just go over this little corner, making some circular motions, brightening up that area. Now for that highlight over there, I'd like to switch back to the Lighten line brush again, because that's a pretty crisp looking highlight. I'll go a bit bigger. I'm at 17%. I'll just add a little highlight here. You can go a little bit lighter here as well. You can just make some final tweaks to your bottle, checking what areas need to go a bit lighter. Perhaps some areas need to darken up a bit more. So just tweak until you are satisfied. Well, we're not there yet. Of course, we also want to work on that drop shadow, or, well, it's not really just a drop shadow. You can also see the reflection of the bottle and some light hitting that surface. I'd like to go to the background layer to work on that area, and just to be sure, let's duplicate the background layer so we always have a backup. And I'll place it underneath that bottle on which we have been working. Let's first add a little shadow. To do that, I would like to use my multiply brush. It's great for adding subtle shadow with this big soft brush. It's set to 20% opacity. Well, let's go to around 20% in size. And let's just grab a purplish gray. Let me go a bit more saturated. Something like this. And let's create a shadow here on the right side. Let me go even smaller with the brush. 6%. I'll make a diagonal line to the outside. And we'll create a little shadow here in the center. And I'm using very, very little pressure on my pen. I also want to use a light gray because I feel like that shadow on the left side, it's a bit less colorful. So let's make a diagonal line here as well. And we have some shadow over here. And we can also go over that purplish shadow. And this brush, it will only work if you use it on the layer which already has the colors. And if some edges are a bit too rough, if you want to smooth them, then we can go to the smudge tool again and use the blender. And we can just go, well, let's make it a bit bigger. Let's go to 39%. And we can just go along that edge and drag that color a bit. And with that smudge tool, with that blender, you can push the colors around a bit. Now, like I said, we don't just have a shadow here, we also have lighter areas. Now let's grab the basic flow brush to add some of those. First I'll pick the local gray color and I'll go a little bit lighter. And now we can add some of those lighter parts. Let me check the brush. Let's set it to 35%. The opacity is at 100%, but opacity is set to pin pressure. So I use very little pressure. You can see that vertical reflection here. And on this side as well. You can zoom out to check it out a bit. See if you like where it's going. I can see that there are quite some pinks at the bottom as well. So let me pick that bottle color. I'll make the brush a bit smaller, 20%. I want to add some pink here at the bottom. Because light is going through that bottle, hitting the table. Go even bigger, 37. Just playing around with that brush size, checking what I need. I'll go smaller again, 20. And when things are starting to look too rough, just grab the smudge tool and smudge it a little bit. I can also see a quite dark area underneath. Let me grab the darken line brush for that. Now let's just pick that bottle color. Let's make the brush 20%. Now let's add a little bit of shadow underneath with a pink color, a dark pink shadow here. And here on this side as well, pretty dark shadow there. And now for a final touch, let's go to the Lighten line brush again. Still using that pinkish color at 25% in size, and let's add a brighter highlight here. Some little tweaks on that highlight here as well. Let's go a bit smaller, 15%. And like I said, when things are getting too rough, not smooth enough, you can just go to the smudge tool, set to that blender, and soften those edges a little bit. Let's also add a little highlight there underneath. You can see that underneath that bottle, there's a tiny light line. Well, you can just keep tweaking this using that smudge tool in between, well, strokes. I feel like this area, it's a little bit dark, so I'm using that smudge tool making it a bit bigger, 50%. And I'm just gonna drag that light area onto that dark area a bit. And remember, you can only use the smudge tool, you can only smudge colors that are on the same layer together. We can make that edge a bit more tight. We can use the basic Flo brush for that. Grab that underground color. Make the brush a bit bigger, 40%. And I'll just go and make a diagonal stroke along that shadow, making it a bit more, tiny bit more crisp there. And on this side as well. And again, you can just grab that smudge tool, go over it, and smooth it. Shall we check difference again? Let me just remove that reference image so we can take a good look. Let me group these layers, and then when we turn them off, this is how we started, without reflections on the bottle, without shadow, without those highlights. And then we used just the basic set with brushes to add all of those highlights and create a realistic looking bottle. So during this workshop, you learned how to create realistic looking highlights on glass like a perfume bottle, and how you can try adding those highlights to your own bottle creations. Remember, any of the assets that I've used during this workshop can be found below the video. Thanks for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing your bottle creations.